Hey, Seraphin here, and today we're going to make the case for pre-ferments. To begin the story, here's some background information. So I am obviously a big fan of pre-ferments. I use Poolish, biga, and Levain quite often, and along with tangzhong or udane, they are simply inseparable from the many recipes I've done. Make sure to check out this lineup if you're new to the channel. Anyways, after releasing these videos, along with the many positive comments I receive, I sometimes get some pretty sour ones too, which are okay with me, but among these negative comments, there are always some very common and almost repetitive parts that catch my eye. First, they often say that pre-ferments are unnecessary. Basically, you can get the same results by mixing everything together and letting the dough age in the fridge overnight. Second, they explain that pre-ferment is meant for commercial or professional situations. In this case, the argument goes like this. Due to space considerations, you can't just simply mix up all the dough and let it age overnight in a giant fridge, which presumably these commercial enterprises do not have. Really? Third, usually in their conclusion, those who use pre-ferments are simply copy-pasting from what other people are doing without knowing exactly what is going on. Ouch. Needless to say, none of these comments came with any scientific citations, so after one too many, I decided to make this video. My main objectives in making this video are twofold: to answer some of the questions you ask and to debunk the misinformation on pre-ferments and long fermentation. Many of you asked me to explain the differences in the many types of pre-ferments, so this video is for you and for some misguided viewers that were parroting what they watch on other channels and then preaching their new belief here. This is my answer to your so far baseless arguments. With that out of the way, first let's take a look at the context of what we're talking about from a historical perspective. What exactly led us to our modern pre-ferments? Historically, much of the bread we've made was fermented with sourdough. Ever since the time of the ancient Egyptians, us humans have come to figure out that this is a delicious and safe way for us to make fluffy bread. Sourdough fermentation was likely discovered spontaneously, a batch of dough suddenly fermented, changing in texture from dense and hard to fluffy and spongy, as well as becoming tastier. Then the ancient bakers likely discovered that they could replicate this by simply saving a piece of the dough from a previous fermented batch to be added into the next batch. This piece of dough, which they could feed with just flour and water when not making bread, is probably what eventually became what we've come to know as a mature sourdough starter. Of course, lacking the ability to time travel, I can only speculate. Now, a thriving mature sourdough starter is essentially a culture of very active wild microorganisms, consisting of yeast and lactic acid bacteria in a mixture of flour and water. It's predictable in its rise and fall, which makes it a reliable leavening agent, but even at its peak, with about 1 billion bacteria colony-forming units, along with 1 to 10 million yeast colony-forming units for every gram of sourdough starter, a sourdough starter isn't necessarily a strong or fast leavening agent in the modern sense. And starters are also often limited in quantity. So over the course of history, traditional bakers who were looking for a better way to use sourdough starters came up with the idea of using a little bit of the starter to make a levain. A levain serves two main purposes. First, it allows us to scale up the number of microorganisms in our sourdough starter to meet the requirements of a certain recipe. Second, it provides us an easy way to alter the flavor and the performance characteristics of our sourdough starter. The levain that we make in such a way with a sourdough starter is basically one of the earliest pre-ferments. As a matter of fact, levain is just another term for pre-ferment in French, or from the modern perspective, you may say levain is just another type of pre-ferment. To make a levain, we start with a small portion of a mature sourdough starter, feed it with a sufficient amount of nutrients, essentially flour and water in equal proportions, and let the mixture ferment until it's doubled or tripled in size. Bubbly, rounded at the top, and just starting to come back down, then we incorporate it into our final dough. Bread making with sourdough was and still is a relatively slow process. This slow process gives the microorganisms in the dough plenty of time to go through the activation of enzymes, acidification, proteolysis, as well as the production of microbial metabolites that eventually produce changes in the dough and the sensory and nutritional quality of the breads. This slow and long fermentation has been our way of making bread for millennia. It is the way of bread making treasured in many great cultures around the world. During the 1840s in France, a beer yeast began to be produced mainly to meet the needs of bread making. When making dough that used yeast as the only leavening agent, bakers at that time logically proceeded according to the same steps as they had with sourdough cultures. Around the same time in Poland, a new method of bread making was developed by Polish bakers. In this method, a liquid fermented culture is made with a small amount of baker's yeast, water, and part of the total flour. This liquid fermented culture was later on given the name Poolish, which is what we know it as today. Poolish is made in advance of dough mixing, usually one day before, with the main purpose of developing more flavor. From Poland, bread making with Poolish was quickly picked up by Viennese bakers. They then began producing this type of bread in Paris, which became well known as Vienna bread. Until the 1920s, the Poolish method seems to be the only bread making method used for the production of breads leavened solely with baker's yeast. After that, we didn't really start to enter the great acceleration of bread baking until the 1920s, when we discovered a speedy way of bread making using commercial baker's yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae. This was the same species that we had been using for thousands of years. As we mentioned before, it's the same yeast that ferments alcoholic drinks like beer or wine. But with science, what we managed to do with it was isolate and selectively grow it in optimum conditions, allowing us to get a lot of yeast in a relatively short amount of time. And when used in fermenting a bread dough, this concentrated yeast is absolutely excellent at fermenting, to the point that it could just take minutes to fully raise the bread dough in certain applications. In these so-called straight dough and no time processes, we set a new lower record on the fermentation time needed to make our bread. For this booming industry, this was great for feeding millions of people from the ever-growing population. Until we realized that the bread made with such a fast fermentation tasted horrible. And to make it worse, this bread didn't last as long as our more traditional breads used to. It staled and spoiled fast. In the age before the widespread use of improvers and preservatives, staling and microbial spoilage of bread were two important reasons behind the alarmingly high contribution of bakery products to food waste. Once high-speed bakers realized the poor performance of the bread they made, attempts were made to return to the use of pre-ferments. The sponge and dough system that became popular in the 70s among industrial bakers is one such example. Among the artisan and home bakers, we went back to Poolish, biga, and later Levain with sourdough. Now, with the historical aspects of the issue laid out properly, let's get into our main subject, our case for pre-ferments. Clearly, nobody disagrees with the fact that throwing in lots of commercial baker's yeast into a wheat dough and letting it ferment quickly is a bad idea. We're now going to go into exactly why this is a bad idea. You see, having sufficient nutrients and excessive amounts of yeast in your bread dough can result in a runaway fermentation that produces too much carbon dioxide. It can get so bad that it actually interferes with the proper development of the dough's gluten network. Lacking a well-developed gluten network, the gas can easily escape from the dough instead of going into the gas cells. We then end up with a collapsed dough instead of an expanded one. Needless to say, this dough would be entirely lacking in important flavor components. In some instances, even if the gluten network develops before the yeast cells produce too much carbon dioxide, the dough may not expand properly due to its weak elasticity. From this paper that examines why rising concentrations of Saccharomyces cerevisiae yeast decreases the dough elasticity in an asymptotic manner, we learned that glutathione contributes to the destabilizing effect of yeast on wheat dough. In the paper, they explained that free SH compounds, as represented by glutathione, considerably contribute to the softening of dough through dead yeast cells. Glutathione, often abbreviated as GSH, is an antioxidant produced in cells and is widely present in plant and animal tissues. In this case, it's found in the wheat flour and also produced in the baker's yeast cells. From the same paper, the researchers revealed that in 27 commercial fresh and dry yeast, up to 81 milligrams glutathione per 1 gram dry sample were found. Also, from this document, we are made aware of the facts that a substantial amount of glutathione leaks out during the rehydration of instant yeast. It happens during the critical time period before the barrier properties of the cell membrane are restored. The larger cell constituents like enzymes and other proteins are retained, while the smaller constituents like glutathione and enzymatic cofactors are lost. Because glutathione is a reducing agent, it tends to reduce mix time and increase dough extensibility. This is desirable in some products like pizza crusts, but increases the oxidation requirement in others like bread making. That's why most instant yeast products used for bread making in North America contain 0.1 to 0.25% ascorbic acid to provide the needed oxidation. Of course, besides the unpleasant flavor due to accumulated dead yeast cells, many other things could happen with too much yeast, including the depletion of amino acids in the dough, resulting in a lot less flavor, as well as an unpalatable amount of alcohol or a complete lack of sweetness, and thus practically no Maillard reaction, making for a very pale crust, and so on. Knowing this, naturally, it makes us wonder, on the other side of the spectrum, what happens if we use a little yeast for a relatively large amount of dough? Well, one thing for sure, it's going to take a long time to ferment the dough, right? Okay, now let's ask the next question. Are there benefits to such a long fermentation? To answer this question, let's have a look at these two papers. The first paper investigated the effects of fermentation temperature and yeast concentration on the aroma profile of the bread. Fermentation was carried out at 3 different temperatures, that is 5 degrees Celsius, 15 degrees Celsius, and 35 degrees Celsius, and with 3 different concentrations of pressed baker's yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, 2%, 4%, and 6%. Baker's percentage, of course. These are the key parameters of the experiment, and here are the results. A total of 46 aroma compounds were identified, of which 45 compounds were confirmed. The results of this study showed that increasing the pressed baker's yeast concentration from 2% to 6% caused an increased formation of the majority of aroma compounds formed from the fermentative activity of yeast. On the other hand, decreasing the fermentation temperature to 5 degrees Celsius was found to increase formation of the 3 esters: ethyl acetate, ethyl hexanoate, and ethyl octanoate in bread, which are often characterized as having a fruity and pleasant aroma. From the results, it is therefore suggested to ferment the dough at a low temperature, 5 degrees Celsius, with a simultaneous increase in the concentration of pressed yeast to 6% in order to develop the bread with a relatively short production time, combined with a high concentration of esters and a low concentration of hexanol and heptanol, which are often characterized as having a respectively green and fatty or rancid odor. So that is one point for long fermentation. The second paper carried out a similar study on the bread crust. The influence of fermentation temperatures and yeast levels on the formation of volatile compounds in the crust of wholemeal wheat bread was investigated. These are the key parameters of the experiment, and after analyzing the levels of volatile compounds in samples of the bread crust, they found that in all crust samples, 28 volatile compounds out of 58 compounds were identified, and the other 30 compounds were tentatively identified. Compatible results were also found with the previous paper. Bread samples fermented at 8 and 16 degrees Celsius resulted in increased amounts of the 3 esters. In this paper, though, the researchers discovered that for the bread crust, a higher amount of yeast fermented at 32 degrees Celsius gave better results. So we now have sufficient scientific facts to say that long fermentation at low temperatures brings out many pleasant aromas in the bread. Of course, there are also other benefits of long fermentation, which we're going to talk about later, but for now, let's take a look at this key question. What is the point of using pre-ferments if long fermentation has been shown to be so effective in producing so many aroma compounds? Well, to answer this question, let's start with this paper. This paper investigated the microbial safety of lean and no-knead dough. From the paper, and I quote, "The growth of inoculated Salmonella enterica and Staphylococcus aureus in no-knead dough during fermentation was significant regardless of yeast brand. Salmonella enterica is an infectious agent, and Staphylococcus aureus is a toxin producer. The no-knead dough method of bread making is a variation of bread making using the long fermentation method, which is a popular method regularly practiced by many artisan and home bakers alike." Now, for relevant information from the paper, In home kitchens, bread dough preparation processes often involve handling multiple ingredients and utensils with bare hands, and the dough may be exposed to unsanitary conditions. In the study, the researchers found that low levels, around 398 colony-forming units, of introduced Salmonella enterica and Staphylococcus aureus can multiply significantly overnight in no-knead slow-rise dough, despite the presence of high levels, more than 10 million colony-forming units of active fermenting yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Although the study was done in the temperature range of 21 degrees Celsius to 38 degrees Celsius, cold long fermentation in the fridge with 5 degrees Celsius is of no exception. Here is why. From the FDA Food Code of 2022, I quote, "Bacterial growth and/or toxin production can occur if time or temperature control for safety food remains in the temperature danger zone of 5 degrees Celsius to 57 degrees Celsius too long." Also quoting the FDA Food Code from 2009, the same paper stated, "Existing food safety rules and regulations in the United States do not allow food handlers to leave food items that are vulnerable to the growth of foodborne pathogens in the temperature danger zone for more than 4 to 6 hours. To give a better perspective of what we're talking about, again from the paper, the food safety concern associated with the possible growth of Salmonella enterica in no-knead dough is similar to that of thawing raw poultry at room temperature. We are all fully aware of the necessary sanitation steps that must be taken for thawing chicken, but we sometimes just don't take the same precautionary steps when it comes to bread baking. Many bakers may think that once the bread goes into the oven at a high temperature, it will practically exterminate all pathogenic bacterial cells, which is true, but here's the issue. During the course of bread making, you may unintentionally initiate cross-contamination of other foods and utensils. Case in point, say you made more than one batch of bread. The baked bread that is being handled in between the processing of another bread dough can be vulnerable to post-baking contamination. That could, in the worst case, result in the dreadful scenario of a salmonella outbreak that I think nobody wants to be a part of. I strongly believe this finding alone should be enough to convince all of us responsible home bakers to raise our awareness of good hygiene practices in home baking. Although it's true that bread made with long fermentation turns out fine most of the time, we should never lower our guard. Proper care must be taken to avoid this type of contamination. So that leads to the next question. Is there a better way to ensure that we can be on the safer side of all of this? In many of my older videos, you may have seen me using this stretch and fold method for most of my bread recipes made using Poolish with fruit yeast water or Levain with sourdough starter. So why was I taking the risk of inviting foodborne pathogens into my breads? From the same paper, I quote, "Prolonged fermentation, up to several days, is used when making traditional sourdough-type breads and pancakes in many regions of the world. In the acid leavening process, bacteria from sourdough starters can generate antimicrobial compounds and lower the dough pH, inhibiting pathogenic and spoilage microorganisms. However, popular no-knead bread recipes rely solely on yeast leavening. The breads made from these recipes do not have a sour taste. The lack of lactic acid fermentation and/or acidity permits the growth of foodborne pathogens in no-knead dough." From the FDA Food Safety Guide, most foodborne bacteria can't grow at pH levels below 4.6. Acidification is one way to maintain safe pH levels and keep various foods safe from harmful bacteria. My mature sourdough starter usually has a pH level of 4, and the fruit yeast water has a pH level around 4.5 to 5. When these leavening agents are made into Levain or Poolish, they carry along their antimicrobial compounds and the acidity-lowering capabilities. So the final dough that incorporates these pre-ferments are expected to inhibit the growth of pathogenic and spoilage microorganisms. This is the explanation for what I did, and it's also one of the most important differences between straight, long fermentation doughs and the ones with these acidic pre-ferments. Now, before we get to the finale of smashing the talking points of those who preach that pre-ferments are useless, let's take a quick glance at the many variety of pre-ferments. First of all, the term pre-ferment generally refers to something a little different for industrial bakers on one side and artisan or home bakers on the other side. There are 3 basic types of pre-ferments made with commercial baker's yeast that are most used by industrial bakers. A sponge pre-ferment is usually made with about 70% of the total dough flour and ferments in a dough trough for 3 to 4 hours. A liquid sponge or flour brew, usually made with about 20 to 50% of the total dough flour, and ferments in a tank for 1 to 2 hours. A water brew or flour-free pre-ferment usually contains sugar instead of flour and ferments in a tank for about an hour. We're not going to go deep into any of these methods for the obvious reason of being home bakers. For the artisan or home bakers like us, we have Poolish, a high hydration pre-ferment, the Italian biga, which is in a way similar to Poolish except for the low hydration, Preferments, which is essentially a pre-fermented dough, and when using sourdough, we have Levain, a pre-ferment made with sourdough starter. If you are new to pre-ferments, don't be intimidated by all these terms, except for the slight difference in Preferment. They are all basically similar in their usage and preparation. A pre-ferment is usually made by taking a portion of a bread dough's flour and water, dropping in a bit of a leavening agent, mixing them all together, and allowing the mixture to slowly ferment for several hours. Once it has ripened, this pre-ferment is then mixed into the final dough. Usually, but not always, these pre-ferments end up serving as the only and final leavening agent in the dough. Typically, pre-ferments ripen between 3 and 18 hours or a few hours longer. Whether they ripen fast or slow depends on the temperature that they ferment in and the amount of leavening agent they started with. Here is a quick look at the many types of pre-ferment and their parameters. Prefermente is not on the list because it is basically just a portion of a lean dough taken out to be used in the mixing of a new dough on the next day. Now, there are numerous benefits that we can derive from using pre-ferments. One of the major characteristics of pre-ferments is the increase in acidity as a result of fermentation activity. In the case of yeasted pre-ferments, such as Poolish and biga, carbon dioxide produced during fermentation seeps into the aqueous mixture and combines with water to form carbonic acid, which the end result is of lowering the dough pH. This rise in acidity is how the dough gains its latent capability to inhibit the growth of pathogenic and spoilage microorganisms, consequently delaying bread staling and avoiding the early onset of bread spoilage. Yeasted pre-ferments usually do not produce that many organic acids, even for those made with fresh yeast that come with some strains of lactic acid bacteria. On the other hand, sourdough pre-ferments have been known to produce significant amounts of organic acids, lactic and acetic acids mostly, which is why the bread tastes sour. From this paper, we have learned that adding organic acids substantially decrease mixing time and weaken the dough. Salt increased the mixing time and strengthened the dough. A combination of both acids and salt increased mixing time and greatly increased dough strength, probably because of changes in gluten-protein conformation. As salt is one of the essential ingredients in our final dough, the overall effect of adding pre-ferments containing organic acids is the strengthening of the dough. Due to the mechanism of dough strengthening as shown in the paper, we can safely speculate that acidic yeasted pre-ferments can also strengthen the dough when paired with salt. Besides the acids, pre-ferments usually go through long fermentation at a low temperature, which have been shown to produce esters, as I've mentioned before. Some of these esters are aromatic compounds that contribute to superior bread flavor. Pre-ferments, when done right, also indirectly scale up the leavening agent, which is why it can speed up the bulk fermentation while at the same time providing more flavor. Okay, now let's compare bread made with long fermentation without pre-ferment and bread made with pre-ferment. To illustrate the complexity of our discussion, I'm going to use a lean bread as our example. A lean bread is essentially made with 4 ingredients: flour, water, salt, and yeast, no sugar. So for fermentation to take place, we need the endogenous amylase enzymes in the flour to work on the starch, break it down into maltose and glucose. If yeast is our sole leavening agent, the yeast will then consume most of the glucose before going for the maltose as their final resource. If it's sourdough, things can get way more complex, but let's simplify it. Say we have a mature sourdough starter with a proper mutualistic balance of Fructilactobacillus sanfracisensis, one of the most common lactic acid bacteria in sourdough, and Kazakhstania humilis, the wild yeast. Maltose will be imported by Fructilactobacillus sanfracisensis, which then releases glucose into the medium after cleaving the maltose with an enzyme, maltose phosphorylase. The wild yeast will then consume the glucose. The yeast cells and also bacteria in the case of sourdough will then multiply and produce many useful metabolites. In yeast fermentation, whether the yeast metabolizes sugar anaerobically or aerobically, they both produce carbon dioxide, which given time will gradually lower the pH of the entire system, hence raising the acidity. Anaerobic fermentation also produces ethanol as byproducts. In the case of sourdough fermentation, there is a positive correlation between low to moderate fermentation temperatures and the presence of Fructilactobacillus sanfrancesensis. At low temperatures with long fermentation times, these bacteria produce a mixture of lactic acid, acetic acid, and or ethanol upon fermentation. The bacteria will produce mostly lactic acids and also acetic acids at higher temperatures, which will contribute to the rising acidity. With the rising acidity, another enzyme in the flour, protease, will become more active. From this paper, we learned that the wheat flour protease enzymes had optimal activity around pH 4, with significant activities being seen between pH 3 to pH 5. These enzymes catalyze proteolysis. Proteolysis is a process in which a protein, including gluten, is broken down partially into peptides, smaller polypeptides, or completely into amino acids. Now, when some of these amino acids are combined with ethanol, they end up as esters. As I have mentioned before, these are the pleasant flavor compounds that make our bread smell good. Some of the other amino acids will become flavor precursors of the Maillard reaction. Through the esters and the Maillard reaction, we get our flavorful bread. A little bit of proteolysis is good for the dough, but too much of it can compromise the entire gluten network, breaking it down into amino acids. Now, we have sufficient information to get into the issue. We go with the sourdough first. When it comes to texture and flavor of a sourdough bread, it boils down to the condition of your sourdough starter. A mature and well-maintained sourdough starter has sufficient metabolites from microbial conversion, organic acids, carbon dioxide, diacetyl, ethanol, and so on. All of this can be beneficial to our bread. When we use this mature sourdough starter to make a levain, we alter its existing flavor by producing a similar but slightly different set of metabolites, and at the same time scaling up the microorganisms. This change happens because we have the liberty of making a levain with different nutrient compositions. Say our sourdough starter is refreshed with a 1-1-1 ratio of starter, flour, and water. When making it into a levain, we can opt to stay at 1-1-1 or switch to 1-2-2, or for that matter, any other reasonable ratios. With these changes and proper handling, we can control the starter, or levain to be exact. We can adjust its acidity and metabolites. Different ratios also end up with different quantities of active microorganisms, hence its gassing power. So in the hands of a seasoned baker, a single sourdough starter can be crafted for use in different kinds of bread recipes by giving it a more suitable flavor, tweaked for different sizes of bread with a more robust levain. If we were to use the sourdough starter directly, we wouldn't really have these choices. That's the difference, and it is a pretty big difference, and it's a very good reason for the use of levain. Now, let's talk about yeasted preferments. With Poolish, because of its higher hydration, we should expect the protease enzymes to be more active. Hence, we can expect more flavor and better texture. With biga, less protease activity should be expected. Prefermente, being an old dough, it really depends on the composition of the dough, so we need not get into it in this video. Now, what is the difference between levain and these yeasted preferments? Besides the obvious, the bacteria that is practically missing in the yeasted preferment, one other big difference is this. When we make a levain, as explained before, we scale up and alter the flavor of the starter, and as it ripens, it has many more robust microorganisms along with a mix of old and new metabolites, hence an altered flavor. So when it comes to the flavor, we start out with certain flavor compounds and end up with an assorted mix of new and old flavor compounds. Now, when we make a yeasted preferment, Poolish or biga, we scale up the yeast and we basically create the primary flavor compounds from scratch. So if you make a sourdough bread with or without levain, you will always have certain flavor compounds to start with, primary and or mixed, but that is not the case with yeasted bread. In this case, if you make a bread without using preferments, Poolish or biga, you practically have to create the flavor compounds from scratch because there were none to start with. It's only when you use preferments that you have the primary flavor compounds from the preferment to start with. This is one of the many important factors to consider when deciding on whether to use or not to use preferments. Consider this. For a lean bread to make these flavor compounds without pre-ferment, you need to first let the endogenous enzymes of the flour break down the starch in the flour so that the yeast can munch on it. And then you have to wait for the yeast to produce sufficient carbon dioxide and ethanol. The carbon dioxide then has to be absorbed by the aqueous mixture of the dough so that it can combine with water within to form acid that will eventually lower the pH, hence raising the acidity. And then when the acidity is right, the protease enzymes catalyze proteolysis, which partially break down the protein protein, including gluten, of the flour into amino acids. And when some of these amino acids combine with ethanol, one of the byproducts of the yeast fermentation, they become esters. They're your flavor compounds. For all of this to happen, it may take hours. So long fermentation is the only way to get these flavors. The fermentation temperature and the amount of yeast will decide how long this long fermentation will take. But there is a catch. Too long a fermentation, you may end up with a very weak dough because there isn't sufficient gluten left in the dough to develop the required gluten network. Your bread will have issues with specific volume, height, and most likely texture and mouthfeel alike. Now, let's compare this with a lean bread with a yeasted pre-ferment, Poolish in this case. The moment we drop in the Poolish, we immediately bring in acidity, esters, ethanol, and large amounts of active yeast, immediately bringing in instant benefits to our final dough. As explained before, bulk fermentation can be better adjusted with minimal risk of runaway proteolysis. We'll also get strengthening of dough due to increased acidity, sufficient and manageable flavor compounds right from the get-go. We'll also have well-measured and a super amount of yeast that's ready to work right from the start. This will minimize the risk of using too much yeast with its unpleasant consequences, as I've mentioned before. So there are clearly many advantages in using pre-ferments instead of long fermentation without it. Now, to give you an idea on how I use a pre-ferment Poolish, I'm going to use these two papers again as my references. In both of these studies, the researchers added sugar, and the first paper used white flour, the second paper whole wheat flour. So they're not exactly talking about a lean dough, but the essence of these studies is relevant to the discussion. These two papers are very interesting. On one hand, the first paper found that in the case of the breadcrumb, a higher concentration of yeast fermenting at a lower temperature at 5 degrees Celsius gave promising results. On the other hand, the second paper discovered that for the crust, a higher amount of yeast fermented at 32 degrees Celsius gave better results. Both studies were done based on 2%, 4%, and 6% concentrations of commercial pressed yeast, which are in instant yeast amounts, 0.66%, 1.32%, and 1.98% respectively. Of course, I have checked these numbers are still within the normal recommendation of the many instant yeast brands that I've used. So let's see how we can make use of this seemingly conflicting information for the benefits of our bread. Let's start by making a Poolish using instant yeast at 1% of the flour that we use for a Poolish, about 0.16% of the total flour baker's percentage. This Poolish will usually ripen after around 3 to 4 hours at my room temperature between 27 degrees Celsius to 29 degrees Celsius. Under these almost ideal conditions, the doubling time of baker's yeast is around 1.5 an hour. So after 3 to 4 hours of fermentation, I should expect the Poolish to have at least 2 times 2 times 0.16% equals about 0.66% of yeast. Now this number is the lowest number of the amount of yeast in both studies. Of course, to get the benefits of a more flavorful fermentation, as suggested by both studies, I do not let my Poolish ferment on the counter for 3 to 4 hours. Instead, I place the Poolish in the fridge at around 5 degrees Celsius to ferment, usually overnight, and use the Poolish the next day. I'm pretty familiar with it after having used it a million times, so I can say that as long as I observe the peak level of the Poolish, I'll be able to use the Poolish in its prime condition. That's how I usually create flavor in my Poolish, while at the same time scaling it up to get to the right concentration of yeast. When this Poolish is used in the final dough, it gives me a bulk fermentation time of around 45 to 60 minutes and a final proof of around the same duration, at room temperatures between 27 to 29 degrees Celsius, with the final yeast concentration around 0.66% as before. With this simple recipe flow, I can ensure that my bread gets pleasant crumb and crust flavor. Now, the great thing about this is that I can still tweak the many parameters of this process. My options are practically unlimited. I can push for more flavor, better texture, better mouthfeel, longer fermentation at lower temperatures, etc., etc. All of this can be done with the minimal risk of exposing my dough to foodborne pathogens by following the proper safety guidelines as recommended by the Food Code. So, in conclusion, to say that pre-ferments are unnecessary and that mixing everything and letting the dough age in the fridge at a low temperature will get you the same or even better results, well, I'm sorry to say it, but that's a bad idea. First, instead of lowering the risk of foodborne pathogens contaminating your dough, you could be unknowingly and recklessly taking your dough all the way to an outbreak. Second, after taking this unnecessary and unhealthy risk, you still don't get a good quality bread. Third, to say pre-ferment is meant for commercial or professional situations due to space considerations, well, that clearly rules out industrial bakers. I'm sure that most of these companies have more than enough refrigerated space to accommodate whatever they deem necessary. As for artisan bakers, I have real doubts that the big fridge is the issue. It's more like the repeatedly unsafe handling and or that processing the dough in such a way may cost them their bakery's license. So I hope I've made the case for pre-ferments with this video. Tell me what you think. And that's it for today. Thank you for watching and bye!